Letter 7. Plato greets the relatives and friends of Dion. You stated in your letter that I should understand that your way of thinking is the same as Dion's, and consequently you invited me to collaborate with you as much as possible, both in word and deed. Well then, I assure you that if you indeed have the same opinions and desires as he did, I will lend my collaboration, but if not, I will have to consider it carefully. Now, what his thoughts and desires consisted of, I can say, not by mere conjecture, but because I know it with absolute precision. In fact, when I first arrived in Syracuse, at about 40 years of age, Dion was the age that Hipporinus is now, and the convictions he acquired then are the same ones he maintained throughout his life. He judged that the Syracusans should be free and governed by the best laws. Therefore, it is not strange that some god has brought Hipporinus to coincide with him in an affinity of political ideals, but the process of generating these ideals is something that young people and those who are no longer young are worth knowing about, and I will try to explain it to you from the beginning, as the opportunity now presents itself. Being young, I went through the same experience as many others. I thought of dedicating myself to politics as soon as I became master of my own actions, and here are the vicissitudes of the public affairs of my homeland that I had to witness. Since the political regime then prevailing was the object of general censure, a revolution occurred. At the head of this revolutionary movement, 51 men were installed as leaders, 10 in the Piraeus and 11 in the capital, in charge of the public administration concerning the agora and municipal affairs, while 30 were installed with full powers at the head of the government in general. It happened that some of these were my relatives and acquaintances, and consequently they immediately requested my collaboration, understanding that these were activities that interested me. My reaction is not surprising. Given my youth, I thought that they were going to govern the city by taking it out of an unjust way of life and leading it to a better order, so I dedicated my most passionate attention to see what they would achieve. And I saw that in a short time they made the previous regime seem good as a golden age. Among other outrages they committed, was sending my friend, the elderly Socrates, whom I would not hesitate to affirm was the most just of the men of his time, to, along with other people, arrest a citizen to forcibly lead him to be executed, an order given so that Socrates would, willingly or unwillingly, become involved in their crimes. By the way, he did not obey, and risked suffering all kinds of punishments rather than become an accomplice to their iniquities. Seeing, I say, all these things and others of the greatest seriousness, filled with indignation, I withdrew from the disgrace of that period. Not long after, the tyranny of the 30 and the entire prevailing political system fell. Again, although less impetuously, the desire to concern myself with the public affairs of the city swept me away. Many things, of course, also happened under that government, being a turbulent period, that could be the object of disapproval, and it is not surprising that, in the midst of a revolution, certain people took excessive revenge on some adversaries. Nevertheless, those who were then repatriated observed considerable moderation. But it also happened that some of those who were in power took my friend Socrates, whom I have just referred to the courts, under the most unjust and least fitting accusation. In effect, some accused of impiety and others condemned and executed the man who one day refused to be an accomplice in the illicit arrest of a supporter of the then proscribed, on an occasion when they were suffering the adversities of exile. As I observed things like these and the men who exercised public powers, as well as the laws and customs, the more closely I examined it, at the same time that my age was acquiring maturity, the more difficult I considered it to administer public affairs correctly. It did not seem possible to me, in effect, to do so without trustworthy friends and collaborators. Finding out who they were was not easy, since the city was no longer governed by the customs and practices of our ancestors, and acquiring new ones with some ease was impossible. On the other hand, both the letter and the spirit of the laws were being corrupted and their number grew with extraordinary speed. In this way, I, who was at first full of enthusiasm to dedicate myself to politics, when I turned my attention to public life and saw it being dragged in all directions by all kinds of currents, ended up feeling dizzy, and although I did not stop reflecting on how to introduce an improvement in it, and consequently in the entire political system, I did, however, stop waiting for successive opportunities to intervene actively, and I ended up acquiring the conviction with respect to all current states that they are, without exception, badly governed. In effect, their legislation has no remedy without an extraordinary reform, accompanied by luck in implementing it, and I was obliged to recognize, in praise of true philosophy, that the perfect and complete vision of what is just, both in the political and private spheres, depends on it, and that the human race will not cease from its evils until those who are rightly and truly philosophers occupy public offices, or else those who exercise power in the states come, by special divine favor, to be philosophers in the authentic sense of the word. This was my way of thinking when I arrived in Italy and Sicily when I went for the first time. And when I arrived, I did not like at any time or in any way the life, pleasant according to the people there, that was led there, filled with banquets in the Italian and Syracusan style, consisting of living by satiating oneself with food twice a day, and not sleeping without company at night, and all the practices that accompany this kind of life. For there is no man under the sky who, living from his youth under a regime based on these customs, can come to be sensible. No one will have such an extraordinary nature as to admit this mixture, or even aspire to moderation, and of course the same could be said of any other aspect of virtue. And certainly, no city can remain calm, whatever laws govern it, populated by men convinced that all wealth must be squandered in excesses and who think that they must remain inactive for everything that is not fine dining, drinking, and the pursuit at all costs of the pleasures of love. It is necessary that such cities never cease to change regimes, tyranny, oligarchy, democracy, and that those who exercise power in them do not tolerate even hearing the name of a just and equitable political system. With these convictions augmented by my previous ones, I went to Syracuse, perhaps led by destiny. It seems, in effect, that a superior being then decided to lay the foundations for the events that have now taken place, concerning Dion and Syracuse, and there is still the danger that these events will multiply in case you do not follow my instructions when I act as counselor for the second time. Well then, in what sense do I say that my arrival in Sicily at that time represented the beginning of everything? It is probable that I, upon engaging in relations with Dion, who was then a young man, and explaining to him in my conversations what I considered to constitute what is best for men, advising him to put it into practice, did not realize that I was somehow preparing the future fall of the tyranny without noticing it myself. Dion, in effect, who was a magnificent disciple in all aspects, and was especially so for the teachings instilled by me at that time, received them with such ardor and enthusiasm, like none of the young people with whom I have had a relationship, and decided to live the rest of his life differently from the majority of the Italians and Sicilians, granting greater esteem to virtue than to pleasure and any other kind of soft living. As a consequence, his life was especially hated by those who live according to the habits proper to the tyrannical regime, until the death of Dionysius took place. After this event, he became convinced that these ideals, which he conceived under the influence of correct teachings, should not remain in him alone, and seeing that those ideals were rooted in others, not in many of course but in some, to whose number he thought that perhaps, with the help of the gods, Dionysius himself could come to belong, he considered that, if such a thing happened, both his life and that of the rest of the Syracusans would become a model of happiness. In addition to this, he thought that it was necessary for me to come to Syracuse by all means and as quickly as possible, as a collaborator in his plans, remembering how easily our mutual relations had managed to instill in him the desire for the noblest and most excellent kind of life, and if the same thing could also be achieved in Dionysius, according to his intention, he had great hopes that without crimes, murders, or the disasters that have now occurred, a truly happy life would be established throughout the country. In this correct conviction, Dion persuaded Dionysius to summon me, and he personally sent me a message asking me to do everything possible to come as quickly as possible, before other people surrounding Dionysius diverted him towards another kind of life that was not the most perfect. Here, although this means dwelling too much on it, is how he asked me, what greater opportunity, he said, should we expect than the one now presented by special divine favor? He insisted on his request, describing the Syracusan Empire in Italy and Sicily and his personal power in it, and speaking to me of the youth of Dionysius and the passionate interest he had in philosophy and instruction. He also told me that his own nephews and relatives were very well disposed towards the way of thinking and kind of life constantly preached by me, and that they were the most suitable to attract Dionysius, so that then, better than ever, the hope that the quality of philosophers and that of heads of great states would coincide in the same people could be fully realized. These were the invitations directed to me, and many others in the same vein, but my thoughts were invaded by the fear inspired by the uncertainty of the result I would obtain with young people, since at that age desires are fleeting and turn contradictory on themselves 1,000 times. On the other hand, I knew that Dion was, concerning his character, a naturally balanced man, and that he was already of a certain age. Consequently, as I reflected full of hesitation whether I should go or what I should do, the opinion prevailed in me that, if ever the ideas conceived about legislation and politics had to be tried to be realized, then the moment had come to attempt it, for by winning a single man to my cause, I would have achieved the complete realization of all kinds of good. With this thought and resolution, I left my homeland, not with the motives that some supposed, but driven mainly by a feeling of shame of myself, that it might seem that I was a man only of words, but who never liked to put his hands to the work, and that I was going to risk, above all, betraying the bonds of hospitality and camaraderie, which united me with Dion, who was in an extremely critical situation. If something were to happen to him, if exiled by Dionysius and by his other enemies he were to come in his exile to take refuge among us and address me, saying, Plato, I come to you exiled, not for lack of hoplites nor for having lacked cavalry forces with which to defend myself from my enemies, what I have lacked are the reasonings and means of persuasion with which I knew that you, better than anyone, are capable of orienting young people towards goodness and justice and putting them in affection and friendship with each other. In the absence of them, through your fault, I have now had to leave Syracuse and am here, and the reproach that my misfortune entails for you is the least of it, but philosophy, which you are continually praising, and which you say is underestimated by the rest of men, has it not perhaps been betrayed on this occasion along with me in what depended on you? If by chance I had lived in Megara, surely you would have come to help me in any undertaking for which I had asked you, or, if you had not done so, you would have considered yourself the most miserable of men. But since things are as they really are, do you perhaps believe that by claiming the considerable journey and the long and arduous crossing you will avoid being considered a coward? Not at all. If these words were addressed to me, I say, could I give a satisfactory answer to them? Certainly not. I went, then, in accordance with the most just reasons that can move a man, and abandoning for them my own and honorable occupations, to place myself under the jurisdiction of a regime of tyranny that seemed inadequate to my doctrine and to my person. With my going there, I freed myself from guilt before Zeus hospitable and irreproachably fulfilled my role as a philosopher, which could have been subject to censure if I, making some concession to comfort and cowardice, had incurred a shameful fault. Upon arriving, since I do not want to be lengthy, I found all of Dionysius' court boiling with intrigues and attempts to defame Dion before the tyrant. I defended him as much as I could, but my influence was scarce, and about 3 months later, Dionysius, accusing Dion of conspiring against the tyranny, put him aboard a small boat and ignominiously exiled him. Next, all of us who were friends of Dion were invaded by the fear that he would accuse and punish any of us, as an accomplice in his conspiracy. As for me, the rumor even circulated in Syracuse that I had died by order of Dionysius, who considered me responsible for all the events that had occurred then. But he, realizing the disposition we were all in, fearing that some greater evil would occur as a result of our suspicions, tried to attract us all through benevolence, and certainly he particularly encouraged me, exhorted me to have confidence, and asked me with all insistence to remain there. In effect, my fleeing from him did him no favor and my staying did, which is why he pretended to ask me with great interest. But we already know that the pleas of tyrants are very much like impositions. Dionysius cunningly prevented my departure from the country, leading me to the Acropolis and making me live there, from where no sailor could have taken me out, much less against the will of Dionysius, but without him arranging it by expressly sending a person with my permission to leave. Nor was there any merchant or official in charge of border surveillance who would have seen me venture out alone without immediately arresting me and taking me back to the presence of Dionysius, especially since the rumor, totally contrary to the previous one, had already spread at that time that Dionysius held Plato in extraordinary esteem. What was the reality of this? It is necessary to tell the truth. He gradually esteemed me more and more over time, as he became familiar with my way of being and my character, but he pretended that I lavished more praise on him than on Dion, and that I considered him my friend to a much greater degree than the latter, and he strongly insisted on achieving that triumph. But as for that happening, if it were to happen, in the best possible way, he avoided intimacy and living with me as a disciple and listener of my philosophical words. He feared, according to what the slanderer said, being betrayed, and that everything was the work of Dion. I, for my part, endured everything, looking out for the plans that had initially made me go there, with the hope that he would come to conceive the desire to live in accordance with philosophy, but his resistance prevailed. The first period of my trip to Sicily and my stay there passed amidst all these hazards. After this I left the island, but I had to return on another occasion urgently requested by Dionysius. What were the causes of my return and the activities I dedicated myself to, and to what extent were they reasonable and just? I will explain all this in detail, for the sake of those who ask what I intended by returning a second time, but first, I will give you my advice on the conduct you should follow in view of the latest events, so as not to allow the secondary to become the main subject of my letter. Well then, what I have to say is the following. I would consider him a man of worth and a good doctor who advised above all to change one's life, to a sick person who follows a regime of life harmful to his health, and who, if the latter agreed, continued to give him the appropriate advice and, if he refused to advise him further. On the contrary, I would consider one who persisted despite this to be as lacking in manhood as in science. The same thing happens with the city, whether its leaders are one or many. If, walking, as one should on the straight path, he asked for advice on something useful, it is proper for the sensible man to advise such people, but if, walking entirely outside of good government and not wanting to return to follow its footsteps, they intimate their counselor to put aside and not touch the question of the regime, because he will die if he touches it, and they impose on him that he advise in service of their wills and whims, on how to always find the greatest expedition and ease in everything, I would consider one who endured such consultations to be lacking in manhood, and a complete man one who did not endure them. Since this is my way of thinking, when someone asks me for advice about some important point regarding their own life, such as the acquisition of goods or the care of the body or the spirit, if it seems to me that their habitual conduct conforms to a certain method, or that when I advise them they will obey me willingly on the points they consult me about, I put all my heart into my advice and do not limit myself to giving it in a merely formal way. But if a person does not ask me for advice at all, or it becomes evident to me that when I advise them they will not obey me, I do not approach that person with my advice on my own initiative, and I would not use coercion on them even if it were my own son, a slave. Yes, I would advise, and if he resisted I would use violence with him. But with a father or a mother it does not seem lawful to me to use it unless they are affected by a mental illness. If it happens that they lead a certain kind of life that is pleasant to them and not to me, it does not seem right to me to make myself hateful to them by uselessly reproaching them, nor by flattering them to collaborate with them by facilitating the satisfaction of their desires to cherish which I myself would not want to live. The sensible man must adjust his way of life to this same criterion with respect to his own country. If it seems to him that it is not well governed, he should say so, as long as he is not going to speak in vain or bring death upon himself with his words, but he should not use violence against his homeland with a view to a change of political regime when it is not possible to establish the most perfect one except at the cost of exiles and deaths. He should adopt a passive attitude and offer prayers to the gods for his own well-being and that of his country. In this same way I can give you my advice, just as I also gave it to Dionysius. In collaboration with Dion, I recommended to him above all that he habitually live in a way that he could become master of himself to the greatest possible degree and gain faithful friends and partisans, so that he would not have to go through the same experience as his father. The latter, in effect, after having taken possession of many great cities in Sicily that had been devastated by the barbarians, was not capable, when reorganizing them, of establishing loyal governments in them formed by his partisans, whether these were foreigners of any origin, or his own brothers whom he had raised himself because they were younger and whom he had converted from simple private individuals into men of government, and from poor to fabulously rich. He did not manage to make any of them a collaborator in his government, despite having contributed persuasion, instruction, favors, and family ties to his effort. He turned out to be 7 times inferior to Darius, who, trusting not in brothers or people raised by him, but only in those who helped him subdue the Mede eunuch, distributed his kingdom to them in 7 parts, each one greater than all of Sicily, and found in these collaborators faithful allies who neither attacked him nor attacked each other, thus giving the example of what a good legislator and a good king should be. In effect, with the laws he established, he achieved the conservation of the Persian Empire until the present moment. Another case is that of the Athenians, without having repopulated many of the Greek cities ravaged by the barbarians themselves, but having taken charge of them when they were still inhabited, they nevertheless maintained their dominion for 70 years, having managed to gain partisans in each of them. But Dionysius, who concentrated the entirety of Sicily in a single city and who, in his omniscience, did not trust anyone, barely managed to save his position. He was poor, in effect, in faithful friends and partisans, and there is no surer indication of a man's goodness or malice than seeing him or not lacking such people. To this referred the advice that Dion and I gave to Dionysius, since due to the work of his father, he found himself isolated from all education, also isolated from adequate company. Above all, in this sense, we induced him to make friends with other young people, chosen from those who were of the same family and the same age as him and who coincided with him in a common eagerness for virtue, but above all, to agree with himself, since the need he had for this was extraordinary. We did not speak to him so clearly, as it would have been dangerous, but rather, employing veiled language, we strove to convince him that this is how every man can save himself and those who are subject to his direction, while, proceeding otherwise, he reaches totally opposite results, that by following the path we indicated to him and becoming a prudent and sensible man, if he reorganized the devastated cities of Sicily and mutually linked them with laws and constitutions, in such a way that a close union of the cities among themselves and with Dionysius himself was established with a view to the common defense against the barbarians, he would achieve not just duplicating, but truly multiplying his father's domains many times over. In effect, if this became a reality, it would be feasible to subject the Carthaginians to a much more effective dominion than that exercised over them in the time of Galen, quite the opposite of what had just happened to his father, who was forced to pay tribute to the barbarians. These were the words and exhortations that we addressed to him, we, who were conspiring against Dionysius according to the rumors that circulated from various sources and which, prevailing in Dionysius' mind, caused Dion's exile and put the rest of us in fear. But, to briefly summarize numerous events, when Dion returned from the Peloponnese and Athens, he gave, and this time practically, a lesson to Dionysius. Well then, after having liberated them and returned their city to them twice, the reaction of the Syracusans towards Dion was the same that Dionysius experienced when the former tried to educate him and make him a king worthy of wielding command, and under these conditions collaborate intimately with him in all the vicissitudes of his life. Dionysius paid attention to the slanderers who claimed that everything Dion was doing at that time he was doing moved by the desire to overthrow the tyranny, with the intention that Dionysius, his attention claimed by the eagerness for culture, would disregard the command and leave it in his hands, and thus be able to usurp it and throw Dionysius from the throne treacherously. These slanders were victorious then, and the same happened when they were propagated for the second time in Syracuse, and it was certainly an absurd and denigrating victory for those who obtained it. It is necessary that those who request my intervention in the current state of affairs learn about what resulted from this. I, an Athenian, a friend of Dion and his ally, went to the tyrant's court with the purpose of establishing harmony where there was discord, but in my fight against the slanderers, I was defeated. And when Dionysius tried to persuade me with honors and riches to side with him and to be a friendly witness for him who would help him give a decent appearance to Dion's exile, he completely failed in his endeavor. Subsequently, when Dion returned to his homeland, he took 2 brothers with him from Athens, whose friendship with him was not born of philosophy, but of the ordinary camaraderie typical of the majority of friends and which is cultivated among them as a consequence of relations of hospitality or initiation into the different degrees of the mysteries. Thus, indeed, for those reasons and for the help they provided him for the return, these 2 friends who accompanied him on his return became his comrades. Upon arriving in Sicily, when they realized the insidious accusations that were being propagated against Dion among the same Sicilians who owed him their liberation, presenting him as a conspirator trying to establish himself as a tyrant, they not only betrayed their friend and host, but were in a way the material authors of his assassination, assisting in helping the assassins with weapons in hand. I do not want to overlook such infamy and impiety, nor am I going to dwell on it, since many are already referring to it in all tones and will continue to do so in the future, but I completely reject what is said about the Athenians that those 2 unworthy fellow citizens have covered our city with shame. I affirm, in effect, that the man who did not consent to betray Dion, when offered the possibility of receiving riches and all kinds of honors in return, was also Athenian. And it is because he was united with him not by a vulgar friendship, but by the community of a liberal education, which is the only thing the sensible man should trust, rather than any spiritual or physical affinity. So it is not fair that the 2 murderers of Dion become a stain on the city, as if they had ever been men worthy of being taken into account. The reason for having spoken about all this has been to instruct Dion's friends and relatives. And now, regarding what has already been set forth, I am going to give you the same advice in using the same words for the third time to you who are the third ones to whom I give it. Do not subject Sicily nor any other state to absolute masters, at least this is my opinion, but to the laws, for this does not benefit either those who subject or those who are subjected, neither them, nor their children, nor their children's children. Trying it leads to total disaster. Only petty and servile spirits like to rapaciously take advantage of such situations, spirits totally foreign to everything that means goodness and justice among gods and men, both with respect to the future and the present. This is what I tried to convince Dion of first, then Dionysius, and now for the third time, you. Listen to my advice, in the name of Zeus the Savior, patron of the third opportunity, and also looking at Dionysius and Dion. The former did not listen to me and now lives with contempt, the latter listened to me and died with honor. It is, in effect, a totally right and beautiful thing to suffer whatever it may be in the eagerness for the greatest goods for oneself and for one's city. None of us is born immortal, and if it happened to anyone to be so, they would not be happy because of it, as the vulgar believe, for there is neither evil nor good that deserve such a name for beings without a soul. Evil and good can only be the heritage of a soul, whether it is united with the body or separated from it. We must always and truly believe in the traditional and sacred doctrines that teach us that the soul is immortal, that it is subject to judges, and that it suffers the maximum punishments when it separates from the body. Hence it must be considered that being a victim of great crimes and injustices is a lesser evil than committing them. The man anxious for material goods and poor in spirit does not listen to these doctrines, and if he listens to them, he ridicules them, or at least he thinks so, and launches with impudent rapacity and without considering their origin on everything that he supposes in his bestial eagerness will serve as a means for him to eat, drink, or be satiated with that servile and crude pleasure falsely called love. He is blind, he does not see the great evil that each of his crimes entails in those acts of rapacity contaminated by impiety that the wrongdoer must necessarily drag along in his pilgrimage on earth and in his journey to the subterranean abodes, a shameful and miserable journey in everything and everywhere. These reasonings and others like them were the ones I used to convince Dion, and with all justice I can feel an indignation against his murderers very similar to the one I feel against Dionysius, because the former and the latter caused me the maximum harm, and it can be said, to all humanity, the former for killing the one who wished to serve justice, the latter, because he refused to serve it throughout his reign, having absolute command as he did. If in that reign philosophy and power had really coincided, among all men, Greeks and barbarians, it would have made shine and implanted the correct opinion that no people or man can be happy if their life does not pass under the standards of justice joined with wisdom, either because he has realized them in himself, or because pious leaders have properly educated and instructed him in their customs. This is the harm that Dionysius caused, and I would consider all the other harms he caused of little importance in comparison with this. The assassin of Dion, for his part, has done, without knowing it, exactly the same thing as Dionysius, for I am completely sure, insofar as one man can be sure of another, that Dion, if he had attained power, would have devoted himself to no other rules of governance than the following. First, he would have freed Syracuse, his homeland, from slavery, and left it radiantly vested with liberty. Subsequently, he would have utilized every means to provide the citizens with the most excellent and suitable laws, and following this, he would have occupied himself with full interest in carrying out the repopulation of the whole of Sicily and its liberation from the barbarians, by expelling some and subjugating others, a thing he would have done with greater ease than Hiero. Once this had become a reality through the work of a man who was just, courageous, sensible, and a philosopher, the same opinion about virtue would have become rooted in the generality of people, which, if Dionysius had listened to me, would have become the patrimony, so to speak, of all humanity and would have saved it. But the truth is that some genius, some malignant spirit, descended upon all with a consequence of lawlessness, atheism, and, what is worse, audacity, the daughter of ignorance, in which all kinds of evils reside, and grow, and yield a most bitter fruit to those responsible for it. This ignorance was what, for the second time, overturned and ruined everything. But let us speak well, for the sake of a good omen, this third time. Nevertheless, I do not want to fail to advise you, his friends, to imitate Dion both in his love for his country and in his sensible way of life, and to seek to carry out, under better auspices, his designs. What these were, I have already explained to you clearly. If any among you is not capable of living with Doric austerity, in accordance with traditional customs, but aspires to the kind of life led by Dion's assassins, to the Sicilian kind of life, do not seek his collaboration nor suppose that he can ever act with loyalty and integrity in anything, but invite all others to collaborate in the general repopulation of Sicily and in the establishment of equitable legislation in it, whether they come from Sicily itself or from any region of the Peloponnese, and do not be afraid of Athens either. For there are also men there who stand out above all others for their virtue and who abhor the shamelessness of those who do not hesitate to murder their guests. But if the truth is that this can be deferred, while the numerous and different daily discords and disorders are pressing upon you, it is necessary that everyone whom a divine providence has endowed with the slightest good sense understand that the evils of those who have engaged in internal struggles will not cease until the victors stop showing their resentment with battles, exiles, and executions and stop taking revenge against their adversaries, until, masters of themselves and having established impartial laws, which absolutely do not imply greater advantages for them than for the vanquished, they force the latter to observe these laws by two coercive means, respect and fear. By fear, by demonstrating the superiority of their force; by respect, by appearing in their eyes as people who know how to overcome their passions and prefer to them their desire and ability to be slaves of the laws. Otherwise, there is no way for the evils to cease in a state divided internally. Seditions, enmities, hatreds, and distrust are usually the patrimony of cities that are in such a disposition. It is necessary that the victors in each case, if they truly desire the general salvation, choose from among themselves, preferably above all others, the men of whom they have the best reports, especially those of mature age, who have a wife and children at home, whose line of known ancestors is as long as possible and enjoys the best reputation, and who all possess sufficient wealth. Supposing a city has 10,000 inhabitants, 50 men who meet these conditions will be enough. These must be attracted, brought out of their homes with pleas and the promise of the greatest honors, and once attracted and having previously taken an oath, they must be asked and urged to establish laws, and that their legislation does not imply greater advantages for the victors or for the vanquished, but equality and community of rights for all citizens. Everything rests on this, on the establishment of the laws. For if the victors submit to them to a greater degree than the vanquished, well-being and happiness will flood the country and all kinds of evils will flee in disarray. Otherwise, do not seek my collaboration or that of anyone who does not heed the present recommendations. All this is closely related to what Dion and I intended, with all our good intention, to achieve in Syracuse in a second attempt. The first was the one made in principle with Dionysius himself, to put into practice a plan that would have been good for everyone, but a fate superior to human designs ruined everything. Try now to bring it to a happier conclusion, with good fortune and special help from heaven. I consider my advice and recommendations concluded, as well as the account of my first journey to the court of Dionysius. How I set out and made the journey for the second time, how reasonably and conveniently, anyone who is interested can learn next. The first period of my stay in Sicily passed in the way I recounted before, offering my advice to the relatives and friends of Dion. Well then, after all that, I persuaded Dionysius as best I could to let me leave, and we both reached an agreement for the time when peace would be restored, for there was war in Sicily then. Dionysius promised that he would bring Dion and me back again, once he had reorganized his government more securely for himself, and he wished Dion to consider the vicissitudes he had gone through not as an exile, but as a change of residence. I agreed to return on these conditions, and when peace was restored he called me, but asked Dion to wait 1 more year. However, he wished me to come at all costs. Dion, for his part, advised and asked me to undertake the journey. Indeed, insistent rumors were circulating from Sicily that Dionysius had once again conceived an extraordinary fondness for philosophy at that time. For this reason, Dion urged me with all insistence to accept the invitation. I knew that it is very common for young men, in relation to philosophy, to go through such phases, but, nevertheless, it seemed safer for me. It was unthinkable at that moment to ignore Dion and Dionysius, and both were offended with me when I replied that I was already an old man and that, moreover, nothing they were doing coincided with what we had agreed upon. It was then, apparently, that Archytas arrived at the court of Dionysius. In fact, before my departure, I had established bonds of hospitality and friendship between Archytas, the Tarentines, and Dionysius. There were also other people in Syracuse who had received certain teachings from Dion, and others who in turn had received them from the former, all of them full of misinterpreted philosophical ideas. My opinion is that these tried to maintain a dialectical exchange on these ideas with Dionysius, convinced that he was already completely instructed in all my philosophical ideas. But Dionysius, who did not lack sufficient natural ability to assimilate this teaching, was utterly dominated by the craving for honors. Surely, he was pleased by those rumors and, at the same time, he was ashamed that it would be discovered that he had learned nothing during the time I was in his company. For this reason, he conceived the desire for a more complete learning, driven also by his vain ambition. The reasons why he did not manage to instruct himself during my first visit I have just explained in the account I gave above. So then, after I returned home without problems and refused to attend his second invitation, as I have just recounted, my opinion is that Dionysius considered it a matter of absolute honor, that no one could believe that I despised him for having known his character, his conduct, and his way of life, and that, displeased by them, I did not want to return to his side. Now, in fairness, I must tell the truth and resign myself to the fact that there will be some who, upon hearing what happened, will belittle my philosophy and judge that the tyrant acted sensibly. Dionysius invited me for the 3rd time, sending a trireme to facilitate my journey. He also sent Archidemus, the man he supposed I esteemed the most in all of Sicily. He was a disciple of Archytas, and other Sicilian friends of mine. All of them repeated the same words to me, that Dionysius had made extraordinary progress in philosophy. He also wrote me a very long letter, knowing well my position with respect to Dion and the interest that the latter in turn had in my making the journey and coming to Syracuse. The letter, which had this beginning and said more or less the following, had been drafted with all this in mind: Dionysius to Plato. The usual greetings followed, and immediately after, without any preamble, it said, "In the event that you now come in response to my pleas, Dion's affairs will first be resolved in the way you desire. I am sure that your desires will be reasonable, and I will accede to them. But otherwise, nothing concerning Dion, both with regard to his affairs in general and his own person, will be resolved to your satisfaction." This is what it said, and in these terms. The rest would be lengthy to explain and out of place. Other letters also arrived from Archytas and the Tarentines, emphasizing Dionysius' philosophical inclinations and saying that, if I did not come then, the friendship that had been created through me between Dionysius and them, and which was of no small importance for the development of their policy, would be totally broken. Such was the invitation addressed to me on that occasion. My friends in Sicily and Italy tried to drag me along, and those in Athens literally drove me out, so to speak, with their pleas, and the familiar phrase was repeated again and again: one must not betray Dion or the guests and friends of Tarentum. The idea was insinuating itself in me that it was not at all strange that a young man, endowed with the capacity to learn, upon continually hearing about sublime subjects, should conceive a passionate desire for the most perfect way of life. It was, therefore, necessary to clearly verify what the reality of the matter was in one sense or another, and not to evade the question in any way or make myself responsible for something that would truly be an injury if there was any truth in what had been said. I set out, overwhelmed by these reflections, despite my many fears and the fact that the omens were not, apparently, very favorable. I arrived, then, and at least in this I was truly successful, and for this I dedicate a third libation to Zeus the Savior. I returned happily safe and sound. And I must thank Dionysius for this, after the gods, for although many wanted to destroy me, he prevented it, and made certain concessions to the feeling of modesty with regard to my affairs. When I arrived, I thought I should first ascertain whether Dionysius was truly inflamed by the fire, so to speak, of philosophy, or whether the insistent rumors that had reached Athens were unfounded. There is a procedure for carrying out this verification that is not lacking in nobility and is truly suitable for use with tyrants, especially if they are full of misunderstood ideas, a condition which I noticed Dionysius suffered from to a high degree as soon as I arrived. This type of person must be shown the philosophical enterprise in its full scope, its true character, the difficulties it presents, and the effort it entails. The one who hears it, if he is a true philosopher, endowed by the gods with a nature apt for this science and worthy of it, considers that a wonderful path has been revealed to him, that he must begin immediately, and that it is not worth living otherwise. He immediately dedicates all his efforts and those of the person guiding him to it, and does not cease until he culminates the enterprise or until he acquires sufficient strength to walk alone, without needing help. In this way, and in accordance with these convictions, the man in question lives, dedicated to his occupations, whatever they may be, but adhering always and in everything to philosophy and to a daily way of life that can generate sobriety of spirit in him, and with it, the maximum ease for learning, remembering, and reflecting. He feels a constant rejection towards any other type of life. However, those who are not true philosophers, but who only have a veneer of opinions like people whose bodies have been lightly tanned by the sun, upon realizing the vast amount of knowledge they must acquire, the magnitude of the work this implies, and the moderation of the way of life that the enterprise requires, consider it difficult and even impossible. For this reason, they are incapable of beginning to practice it, and some even become convinced that they have already heard enough of everything and do not need to strive any more. This is an obvious and infallible test to use with lazy people who are incapable of effort, so that they cannot blame their guide, but themselves, for not being capable of following the appropriate practices to reach the goal. This was the meaning of the words I then addressed to Dionysius, since, of course, neither did I give him a complete explanation nor did he ask for one. He boasted, in fact, of knowing many things, and certainly the most important ones, and of being sufficiently informed due to the poorly assimilated teachings he had received from others. I understand that he has subsequently even written a book about the matters he learned then, presenting it as the fruit of his own knowledge and not of the instruction received, but I do not know anything for sure about it. I already know that there are others who have written about these same issues, but who are they? They do not even know themselves. What I can say about all past or future writers who claim to be informed of what is the object of my efforts, either because they learned it from me or from others, or because they discovered it themselves, is the following: it is impossible, in my opinion, that they have any solid knowledge of the subject. Certainly, a work of mine referring to these questions neither exists nor ever will exist. They cannot, in fact, be reduced to expression, as happens with other branches of knowledge, but as a result of a prolonged intimacy with the problem itself and living with it. Suddenly, as if bursting from a spark, light dawns in the soul and is nourished by itself. Of one thing I am sure, no one could better make the exposition of these matters in writing or verbally than I, but I also know that the defects of this exposition would cause no one more displeasure than me. If I believed that they were susceptible to being satisfactorily expressed by written or oral language for the masses, to what nobler enterprise could I have dedicated my life than to writing something that would represent a maximum service to humanity and bring to light for universal knowledge the nature of things? But I do not think that the so-called philosophical disquisition is good for men, except for a small minority of them who are precisely capable of discovering the truth for themselves with a minimum of initiation. As for the rest, some would conceive an unjust contempt, totally inadequate, and others a proud and foolish presumption, in the idea that they were instructed in sublime doctrines. I still intend to speak more extensively about this issue. Perhaps after my words, a greater evidence will arise about what I am saying. There is, in fact, a solid argument against anyone who dares to write the slightest thing about these matters. It has been exposed by me 1,000 times on other occasions, but it seems appropriate to repeat it once more. There exist for each of the beings three elements that must necessarily be used to reach knowledge of it. The fourth is knowledge itself, and one must add, in the fifth place, the thing in itself, noble and real. 1. The first element is the name, the word that designates the object. 2. The second, the definition, composed of names and predicates, for example, that which is everywhere equidistant from the extremities to the center, for the circle. 3. The third, the image, the figure that is drawn and erased again, is traced in rotation and destroyed, but none of this happens to the circle itself, to which all these representations refer, as something distinct from them. 4. The fourth is knowledge, the intelligence and the correct opinion about these objects. All of this must be considered as one thing, which resides not in words or in the figures of bodies, but in souls. It is thus evident that it is something distinct both from the nature of the circle itself and from the three previously mentioned elements. Of all these elements, the one that is closest to the fifth by affinity and resemblance is intelligence, the others are further away from it. Just as this can be applied to the circular form, it can also be applied to the straight line, as well as to colors, to the good, the beautiful, and the just, to every body, whether artificial or existing by nature, to fire and water and all things of that kind, to the totality of living beings and the traits of the soul, to all kinds of actions and passions. If in all these things one does not manage to grasp the four elements mentioned in some way, one will never come to participate in a perfect notion of the fifth. Furthermore, the former try to show the quality of each thing, no less than its essence, using something as weak as the word. Taking this into account, no intelligent person will risk entrusting their thoughts to this weak means of expression, especially when it must be fixed, as is the case with the written word. Here is a new point in our exposition that must be understood. Every circle that is drawn or traced in rotation in practice is imbued with that which is the opposite of the fifth element, for it is in contact in all its parts with the straight. The circle in itself, on the other hand, we affirm, does not contain the contrary nature in the least. We also say that the name of objects is in no way a fixed thing for any of them, and that nothing prevents the things now called round from being called straight and the straight, round. Their significant value will not be less consistent for those who make the change and call them by the opposite names. Regarding the definition, the same can be said. Since it is composed of names and predicates, there is no sufficiently firm consistency in it. 1,000 reasons could be adduced about the obscurity of these four elements, But the main one is what I just said a moment ago, that there are two different things, essence and quality, of which the soul seeks to know not the quality but the essence, but each of the four elements cited presents to the soul, both by word and in deeds, precisely that which it is not seeking, and offers it an expression and manifestation exposed in each case to be refuted by the senses, filling, so to speak, any man with total perplexity and confusion. Now, in those specific cases where, due to our defective education, we are not accustomed to investigating the truth and any image offered to us suffices, we will not incur ridicule among ourselves, those who are questioned before those who ask and are capable of analyzing and criticizing the four elements of knowledge. But in those cases where we are forced to answer and give a clear explanation about the fifth, anyone capable of refuting gains an advantage over us whenever they want, and manages to make the one who is explaining verbally or in writing or through answers, give the impression to the majority of his audience that he knows nothing about what he is trying to write or say. They sometimes do not realize that it is not the mind of the writer or speaker that is being refuted, but the essentially defective nature of the four instruments of knowledge. However, by dint of discoursing about all of them, going through each one in every direction, at the cost of much effort, knowledge of a well-constituted object in turn is produced in a well-constituted mind. But if the dispositions are naturally bad, and this is the natural state of the soul in most people, both with regard to the capacity to learn and what is called moral character, sometimes such a state is a consequence of corruption. To these people not even Linsus himself could make things clearly visible. In a word, to the man who lacks affinity with the matter in question, neither intellectual ease nor memory could provide it, since it does not arise in natures alien to that matter in the first place. So those who are not naturally inclined and spiritually akin to justice and all other virtues, even if they have facility in other aspects for learning and remembering, as well as those who possess natural affinity but lack intellectual capacity and memory, will never, neither one nor the other, know the truth about virtue and vice to the extent that it can be known. For it is necessary to learn both things together, the true and the false of everything that has a real being, through intense exercise and long time, as I said at the beginning, when the different elements, names and definitions, perceptions of sight and the other senses, are brought into contact with each other at the cost of 1,000 efforts, when they are subjected to benevolent critical discussions, in which questions and answers are made without bad intention, intelligence and comprehension of each object suddenly burst forth, reaching the maximum limit of human capacity in its effort. Consequently, any man who takes seriously what must be taken seriously will be very careful not to expose it to the malevolence and lack of capacity of people, by entrusting it to writing. From all this, one must draw the conclusion, in a word, that when a writing by someone is seen, whether by a legislator about laws, or a treatise about any other subject, the issues set forth are not considered by the author as being of greater gravity, if he for his part is a serious man, but that what is most important is deposited in the most select part of his being. But if he, genuinely attributing importance to such issues, has entrusted them to written characters, then surely it is not the gods, but men, who have made him lose his mind. Whoever has followed this reasoning and digression will be convinced that if Dionysius or any other person of greater or lesser stature has composed a book on the lofty and primordial questions concerning the nature of things, according to my opinion, it is because he had not heard or learned any sound doctrine on the matters he has discussed. Otherwise, he would have felt the same veneration for these truths as I do, and would not have dared to launch them into a world discordant and unsuited to them, nor could the motive for writing about them have been to aid memory, as there is no fear of them being forgotten once they have penetrated the soul, since they are contained in the briefest terms. If he did, the motive would rather be a despicable ambition, whether he presented the doctrine as his own or sought to imply that he possessed a formation of which he was unworthy, desirous of the resulting glory of possessing it. If Dionysius acquired this knowledge as a result of a single conversation with me, perhaps he has it, but how this could be, Zeus will know, as the Thebans say, for I gave him an explanation in the manner I have recounted, and only once, but never again did I do so. And now it is necessary for everyone interested in finding out how the events truly happened to learn the reason why we did not continue our lessons on a second and third occasion or any other. Did Dionysius, after hearing me once, think that he already knew enough, and indeed knew it, either through his own discoveries or through previous teachings from other masters? Or did he judge that my doctrines were worthless, or, the third hypothesis, that they were not suitable for him personally, but too elevated for him, and that he was not truly capable of leading a life dedicated to wisdom and virtue? If he thought they were worthless, he is in conflict with many witnesses who affirm the contrary and who have much more authority than Dionysius to be judges of these issues. If he believed that he had discovered or learned truths, and that these were precious for the education of a free soul, how could he then, unless he were an extravagant man, so easily insult the person who had been his guide and tutor in the matter? What the insults consisted of I will now recount. Not long after the narrated events, even though he had until then allowed Dion to possess his property and enjoy the revenues, he forbade his administrators from sending them to the Peloponnese in the future, as if he had completely forgotten his letter. He alleged that the property belonged, not to Dion, but to his son, who was his nephew and whose guardianship belonged to him according to the law. These are the facts that happened at that time up to the moment I refer to. They had completely opened my eyes about Dionysius' philosophical aspirations, and indignation was taking its course, with or without my will. Summer had arrived, and with it the time for ships to sail. My opinion was that I should not be angry with Dionysius, but rather with myself and those who had forced me to cross the Strait of Scylla for the third time to once again face the fatal Charybdis, and that I should tell him that it was impossible for me to remain there after Dion had been subjected to such unworthy treatment. He tried to calm me down and asked me to stay, thinking that it did him no favor for me to leave so quickly, carrying such news. When he failed to persuade me, he said that he himself would arrange my journey. I, for my part, had planned to embark on any of the merchant ships and leave, irritated as I was and determined to face anything if obstacles were put in my way, since, evidently, I had not committed any offense, but rather had received one. Seeing that I was absolutely unwilling to stay, he devised the following means to detain me during that sailing season. The next day he came to see me and addressed these persuasive words to me: "Let Dion and his affairs," he said, "cease to be an obstacle and a cause of continuous discord between you and me. Here," he added, "is what I will do for Dion in consideration of you. I ask him to take possession of his property and reside in the Peloponnese, not as an exile, but with the idea that he can return here when he and I and your friends mutually agree. This is on the condition that he does not conspire against me. You and yours and Dion's relatives in Syracuse will be guarantors of this, and that he in turn gives you guarantees. The money he takes will be deposited in the Peloponnese and in Athens in the hands of the people you decide, and Dion will enjoy the revenues, but will not be authorized to dispose of the property without your consent. I do not trust much, in fact, that he will act loyally with me in the use of his property, for its amount will be considerable, but I have greater confidence in you and yours. See, then, if you agree to this, and on such conditions, stay here this year. When it is complete, you can leave, taking the money with you. I am sure that Dion will be very grateful to you if you carry this out in his favor." Hearing this proposal filled me with displeasure. Nevertheless, I replied that I would think about it and communicate my decisions regarding it the next day. We agreed to this for the moment. I then began to deliberate with myself, seized by the greatest confusion, The thought that predominated first in my deliberation was the following: let's see, suppose Dionysius has no intention of doing anything he says, but, if I leave, he writes Dion a letter full of plausible reasons and orders several of his people to do the same, that he communicates to him what he has just told me, alleging that, since he wished it, it was I who refused to put his proposals into practice, ignoring Dion's interests. Besides this, suppose he does not want to let me leave, and without giving personal orders to any ship captain, he clearly lets everyone know that he does not want me to leave. Will anyone consent to take me as a passenger once I leave Dionysius' house? I was lodged, in fact, to make matters worse, in the garden that surrounded the palace, from where the doorman would not have allowed me to leave without having received an order from him. On the other hand, if I wait during this year, I can communicate all this to Dion, the situation I am in and what I am trying to achieve, and if Dionysius fulfills any of what he promises, my conduct will not have been completely ridiculous, for Dion's fortune, well evaluated, surely amounts to no less than 100 talents. However, if things as they currently stand continue the course that they logically must follow, I do not know what will become of me. Nevertheless, perhaps it is necessary to struggle for one more year and try to reveal Dionysius' astute machinations through actions. Having made this decision, I told Dionysius the next day, I have decided to stay. However, I added, I ask that you do not consider me a fully authorized representative of Dion, that you write him a letter, jointly with me, expressing the resolutions we have adopted and ask him if these satisfy him. Otherwise, if he desires and requests anything else, that he communicate it as soon as possible. In the meantime, you should not take any measure that affects his interests. This is what I told him, and this is what we agreed upon, approximately in the terms I have just set forth. The ships then sailed, and it was no longer possible for me to leave, when it occurred to Dionysius to warn me that half of the property should be considered as belonging to Dion and the other half to his son. He said he would sell it, and once its value was realized, he would give me half to take away and the other half he would leave there for the child, that this was the most just thing to do. Although such words were a blow to me, I considered it ridiculous to raise any objection. Nevertheless, I argued that we should wait for Dion's letter and write to him again communicating these new developments. But he, immediately after, brazenly proceeded to sell all of Dion's properties, in the manner and way he wanted and to whomever he wanted, without saying a single word to me about it, nor did I speak to him again about Dion's interests, as I foresaw that I would achieve nothing. Up to this moment I had sought to assist philosophy and my friends in this manner. From now on, this is how Dionysius and I lived, I, with my eyes fixed on the outside, like a bird longing to fly from its cage, he, contriving to discover means to intimidate me and without having returned any of Dion's fortune. Nevertheless, we called each other friends in the face of all Sicily. Around that time, Dionysius, departing from the norms followed by his father, tried to reduce the pay of the veteran mercenaries. The soldiers, furious, gathered in assembly and declared that they were not willing to consent. He tried to use violence, closing the gates of the Acropolis, but they immediately rushed against the walls, shouting an unintelligible and fierce war chant. At this, Dionysius, overcome with terror, largely agreed to all the conditions demanded by the peltasts gathered at the time. Soon the rumor spread that Heraclides had been responsible for all these events. When that rumor reached his ears, Heraclides disappeared and went into hiding. Dionysius was looking for a way to capture him, but not finding him, he called Theodotes to his garden. It so happened that I was also in the garden at that moment, walking. I do not know the rest of the conversation, as I did not hear it, but I know and perfectly remember this, that Theodotes said to Dionysius in front of me, Plato were his words, I am trying to convince Dionysius that, if I am able to bring Heraclides here into our presence to answer the accusations that have been made against him, if he decides not to allow him to live in Sicily, that he let him leave. This is my request, with his son and wife to the Peloponnese, and live there without causing any harm to Dionysius and enjoying the revenue from his property. I have previously sent for him, and I will send again, to see if he obeys, either my first or my second call, but I beg and implore Dionysius, that if he is found in the countryside or here, no harm should befall him other than being exiled from the country until Dionysius' further decision. And addressing him he asked, "Do you consent to it?" "I consent," he replied, "and even if he is found in the vicinity of your house, he will suffer no harm beyond what has been agreed upon now." The next day in the afternoon, Eurybius and Theodotes came to me hastily and extraordinarily disturbed, and Theodotes said to me, "Plato, you were present yesterday when Dionysius reached an agreement with you and me regarding Heraclides." "Certainly," I replied. "Well now," he continued, "there are peltasts running everywhere with the intention of capturing him, and it is likely that he is in these vicinity, so accompany us by any means to see Dionysius." So we went and presented ourselves before him. The two of them remained silent, with tears in their eyes. For my part, I said to him, "They are afraid that you will take some violent measure with respect to Heraclides, contrary to what was agreed upon yesterday, for, apparently, he has returned and has been seen in this vicinity." Hearing this, Dionysius burst into anger and his face changed color repeatedly, as happens to an enraged man. Theodotes, falling at his feet and grabbing his hand, burst into tears and began to implore him not to do such a thing. Then I replied, trying to encourage him, "Be calm, Theodotes, Dionysius will not dare to do anything contrary to his promises of yesterday." Dionysius fixed his eyes on me, and with all the arrogance of a tyrant, he said to me, "I have not made the slightest promise." "By the gods, you have," I replied, "and precisely the one to abstain from what this man is asking you not to do." Having said this, I turned around and left. He then proceeded with the capture of Heraclides, while Theodotes sent emissaries to the latter urging him to flee. Dionysius sent Tisias in pursuit of him, with a detachment of peltasts. But, it was said, Heraclides was only a few hours ahead of him and took refuge in Carthaginian territory. After these events, Dionysius thought that his old project of not returning Dion's property already had a persuasive excuse in his enmity toward me. First of all, he forced me out of the Acropolis, alleging as a pretext that the women had to offer a 10-day sacrifice in the garden where I was staying. He ordered me, therefore, to spend this time away, at Archidemus' house. While I was there, Theodotes sent for me. He grieved over everything that had happened and complained about Dionysius. When the latter found out that I had gone to Theodotes' house, he took the fact as a new pretext of the same nature as the previous one to deepen his differences with me. He asked me through a messenger if I had really had a meeting with Theodotes at his invitation. "That is indeed the case," I replied. "In that case," replied the envoy, "he instructs me to tell you that you do very wrong in always granting greater esteem to Dion and his friends than to him." This is what was said, and he did not call me back to his palace again, as if it had become perfectly clear that I was a friend of Theodotes and Heraclides and his enemy. Furthermore, he assumed that I could not be well disposed towards him since Dion's property was completely lost. From then on, I lived outside the Acropolis, among the mercenaries. Among other visitors, I received some oarsmen of Athenian origin, my fellow citizens, who informed me that I was being defamed among the peltasts and that some were threatening to kill me if they managed to seize me. Then I devised the following means to save myself. I sent a message to Archytas and my other friends in Tarentum, explaining the circumstances I was in. They, under the guise of an embassy, sent a 30-oared ship from the city, as well as Lamiscus, one of the group. As soon as he arrived, he went to intercede for me with Dionysius, saying that I wished to leave and that he should by no means oppose it. Dionysius consented and let me leave, giving me money for the journey, but regarding Dion's property, neither did I ask for anything nor did he give me anything. When I arrived at the Peloponnese, at Olympia, I met Dion who was attending the games, and I told him what had happened. He, calling Zeus as a witness, immediately urged me and my relatives and friends to prepare for revenge against Dionysius. For his betrayal of hospitality he said it as he thought it, and he, for his unjust expulsion and exile. Hearing this, I told him to seek the help of my friends if they agreed to lend it. As for me, I added, you and the others forced me to share the table, the dwelling, and the sacrifices of Dionysius. He perhaps, under the influence of so many slanderers, thought that I was conspiring with you against his person and against the tyrannical regime, and yet, he did not take my life. A feeling of shame prevented him. Furthermore, I am no longer at a very appropriate age to fight as anyone's ally. On the contrary, I am at the disposal of you both whenever you wish to resume your friendship and benefit each other, but as long as you wish to cause harm to each other, go to others. These were my words, because I had come to experience horror at my wanderings in Sicily and my failure. But by not listening to me and not heeding my arguments, they became responsible for the evils that have now fallen upon them. None of these would have occurred, as far as can be humanly foreseen, if Dionysius had returned to Dion's property or had reached a compromise with him by any means. Then, indeed, I would have had the will and sufficient strength to contain Dion more easily. Instead, by clashing with each other, they have filled everything with disasters, and yet, Dion's intentions were the same as I would affirm should motivate me or any sensible man, both with regard to his personal power, as to his friends, as to his homeland. He would aspire to nothing other than to render the greatest services and thus become powerful and honored among all. And this certainly does not happen when someone enriches himself, his followers, and his city by conspiring and plotting. Being personally a poor man, lacking self-control, overcome by the cowardice that prevents one from fighting against pleasures, when he kills the rich, calling them adversaries, and squanders their goods and invites his collaborators and followers to do the same so that none of them have to reproach him for his poverty. The same can be affirmed of someone who serves his city, and consequently is honored by it, by distributing the goods of a few to the masses by decree, or who, being at the head of a large state that exercises hegemony over several weaker ones, transfers the possessions of the smaller ones to the power of his own state against all justice. Neither Dion nor any man, in fact, would willingly seek power through these means, a power that would be fatal to him and his race forever. Rather, he would tend towards a regime and legislation of the greatest justice and excellence, which would be imposed without the slightest slaughter or exile. This is precisely what Dion was trying to achieve now, and he preferred to be a victim of iniquity rather than commit it, and, although he also took precautions not to suffer it, he nevertheless succumbed, when he had already reached the peak of victory over his adversaries. And it is not surprising that this happened to him. An honorable man, when dealing with those who are not, if he possesses wisdom and prudence, will never be completely deceived about the character of such people, but surely it will not be strange for the same thing to happen to him as would happen to a good pilot who did not fail to notice that a storm was approaching, but who could not foresee its extraordinary and unexpected magnitude, and, not having foreseen it, was submerged by the violence of the waves. This very thing caused Dion's downfall by a very small margin. He knew well that those who caused his downfall were wicked, but he did not come to suspect how deep their stupidity and their perversion and voracity were in all aspects. For this reason, he succumbed, plunging Sicily into immense mourning. After what I have just recounted, it can be said that my advice has already been set forth, and I need not insist on it. As for the reason for having resumed the account by narrating my second journey to Sicily, it is because it seemed necessary to me due to the absurd and illogical turn that events took. If this explanation of mine contributes to making them more intelligible and to judging the motives as adequate to the results, the account which I now conclude can be considered adequate and satisfactory.